some other proposition Q is settled or already true. What principles govern at an earlier stage then? I'm going to assume that each divine choice makes a cut. Sometimes the same cut that is made by a bunch of other choices, though perhaps sometimes not. So some choices will be the sole choice or largest choice at a given juncture. I'll assume that there aren't stages that are incommensurable, that share only proper subsets. There might be some use for that idea. I shall assume that explanatory priority is transitive, asymmetrical, and irreflexive. There's justification for assuming transitivity or agglomeration. Once God knows something, he can't forget it for purposes of subsequent decisions. That's the idea of agglomeration. If the fact that P is a reason or a potential reason God could give for bringing it about or allowing it to be the case that Q, and it is a fact that Q, and this fact is a reason or a potential reason for his bringing about or allowing it to be the case that R, then God cannot turn around and cite the fact that R as a reason for causing or allowing P to be true. God will not have given a reason for any member of the chain of facts if he provides reasons that go around in a circle. God might point to positive aspects of the overall state combining all three facts as a reason for allowing or causing their conjunction, but that's to appeal to some further fact about the whole chain. So here are some definitions that are meant to explicate the idea of explanatory priority in God's knowledge. And there's going to be some assumptions built in here about divine choices and the transitivity of explanatory priority. I'm going to assume that what God chooses is whether or not to make a certain proposition true. Those are God's decrees, have that sort of form. You wouldn't have to take them that way necessarily, but let's do it. It makes it simple. So here's a definition. S is the stage in God's knowledge prior to his choice to bring about P. And what I mean by this is that for any proposition Q that God knows, Q is a member of S if and only if Q could be taken into account in God's decision whether to bring about P. Stage S1 is earlier than S2. S1 and S2 are stages in God's knowledge, and S1 is a proper subset of S2. The assumption is built in there of agglomeration. And P is going to be explanatorily prior to Q in God's knowledge, just in case P is a part of a stage that does not include Q, and Q is also foreknown. I should have added that. This principle, P1, follows from the way stages have been defined and the assumption of transitivity. For every decision God makes, only propositions that are parts of stages prior to the decision can properly be cited as considerations God was able to take into account in coming to that decision. This is just sort of fixing a framework in which to talk about explanatory priority among the things that God knows relative to the choices that God makes and the reasons he has. Let's skip on to Molinism, the indented statement. Here's what Molinism says in terms of this framework. There are two stages in God's knowledge. I know, Molinism says there's three, right, because there's one in the middle. But in this framework, there's only two. Stage one, though, contains two parts. A, the necessary truths, and B, these conditionals of freedom, specifying what every possible free creature would freely do in every possible circumstance in which the creature would have libertarian, indeterministic freedom. B, the conditionals of freedom, is in some sense posterior to A, so it's in the middle. But both A and B are known from all eternity and prior to any creative decisions. Stage two, then, contains everything else, all the rest of God's foreknowledge. The two stages are separated by God's deciding what the world should be like prior to any free decisions by creatures and how God will respond when the time comes to fill in the parts of the world that come after their free decisions. And according to the Molinist, God does that all at once. Simple foreknowledge, though, says there are no CFs, conditionals of freedom. And simple foreknowledge also has libertarian free will on the table. They say there's free will and libertarianism is true. So it's natural to suppose on this simple foreknowledge view that the atemporal growth of stages, the order in which God's foreknowledge sort of builds up, involves God's allowing agents to face decisions before, quote unquote, in the explanatory hierarchy, before he knows what they will do. God's being free to act for reasons seems to require that the notion of stages in God's knowledge makes sense, but then the possibility arises that our free choices may mark stages beyond which God cannot see with absolute certainty. So even with absolute foreknowledge or timeless knowledge, a libertarian may well hold a divine risk model of providence. Suppose all God has decided prior to some stage S is to create Adam and Eve after so many years of universe building. If there are no conditionals of freedom known at prior stages prior to S, conditionals of freedom about what Adam and Eve would do when free, God doesn't know what they'll do yet. He unrolls the scroll a bit further, so to speak, or he resolves to create them and put them in certain circumstances. You might say God queries the future by resolving to create them and then seeing what they do, so to speak. Everything he's done and knows up to stage S is consistent with Eve freely sinning or not. Now, after deciding enough to make it certain that Eve will exist in such circumstances, God comes to know at stage S+1 that Eve freely sins. God may have prior conditional intentions. If she sins, I will let her offer the fruit to Adam and so on. If she doesn't, I'll reward her and I'll kill that snake. Or maybe I'll have the snake offer it to Adam and see what happens then. Anyway, God might have these kind of conditional intentions, but only at stage S+1 does he know what he himself, in fact, does in response to her free choice. So on this picture, P2 has got to be true. If S is the stage in God's knowledge prior to his decision to use his foreknowledge concerning P's truth or falsehood, then 1, S contains neither P nor the falsity of P. 2, the decision does not include a decision to make P true or false. And 3, every stage later than S includes either P or the falsity of P. So I'm sort of imagining him deciding what he wants to know in the future. But I think in the typical cases where God has decided to put someone in certain free conditions, there isn't really a decision on God's part. He just then automatically knows that fact, what they will do in those circumstances. Later on, though, the idea is going to come up that there might be substantive choices that God makes about which facts about the future he wants to know. So we'll get to that. If this is how foreknowledge goes, then foreknowledge of what a certain creature will freely do in certain circumstances would not help God to decide whether to put the creature in those circumstances. Knowledge of the creature's choice does not appear in stages before God has decided to allow the creature to enter into those circumstances, and God is from eternity responding to what creatures freely do, and he can't use information about what they'll freely do when deciding whether to put them in certain circumstances. And that's all sort of summed up there in that risky providence with foreknowledge. And I'm not going to read it. Someone committed to simple foreknowledge and libertarianism must believe that God takes risks. And I think the simple foreknowledge advocates that I'm thinking about, David Hunt is the exemplar I have most in mind here, do accept this. God does take risks in this sense. If a creature faces a free decision, then there's a stage in God's knowledge at which God knows that the creature will face the decision, but not what it will freely do. But how many risks does God take on this view? Is the view the practical and, for that matter, moral equivalent of open theism? Do the stages of God's eternal knowledge just mirror the temporal stages in God's knowledge posited by the open theist? On the open theist view, God immediately prior to allowing a creature to make a certain free decision does not know the outcomes of any free choices that are temporally posterior to that one. Is something exactly like that happening in the stages in God's knowledge? Would simple foreknowledge provide God no advantages that he would lack were open theism true? David Hunt argues that there would be providential advantages, and I don't want to say that there could be none. I can think of some, and he's pointed out some which I have to admit are really there. Suppose that God is going to create Adam and Eve and put them in 2 rooms and have them tempted at the same time. It's up to God what to do here. He could decide, I'm going to tempt Adam with one fruit, let's say pears, but I'm not sure what I'm going to tempt Eve with. But I'm settling it that I'm going to tempt Adam with pears. Oh, Adam sins. Okay, well, I don't want pears to be ruined for Eve, so I'll tempt her with oranges. Now, these free choices happen at the same time. The open theist can't imagine that God does things that way.